Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in places that could expose you to identity theft. That's why LifeLock monitors millions of data points every second. If your identity is stolen, their US-based restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Rated T to M. Hey, want to hear a PC Game Pass ad? I'll take your silence as a yes. Want new games on day one like Call of Duty Black Ops 6 or Stalker 2? I thought so. How about unlocking all the League of Legends champions when you link your Riot Games account? All for one low monthly price? Well, guess what? We got you. Learn more at xbox.com/PC Game Pass or click the banner. Stalker 2 available November 20th, 2024. Game catalog varies by region and over time. And that's the end of the script.
He's Canada's founder, the man who stitched together various colonies into one new nation. Sir John A. Macdonald was revered in Canada for many years. Now he's on the cancel list. Hello and welcome to the Full Comment Podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. Thanks for listening. And if you enjoy this episode, if you enjoy this podcast, please hit the subscribe button so we can keep the good conversations going. Today, we're talking about Sir John A. and his true legacy, a legacy that's now under attack. Statues have been taken down in places like Kingston, Charlottetown, Victoria, and Picton, where he practiced law. Here in Toronto at Queen's Park, the Ontario legislature, the statue of Sir John A. is boarded up at the request of the Speaker, and a legislative committee is conducting a study on what should be done. And in Kingston, at his former home, Bellevue House, it's run by Parks Canada. Well, they reopened this year with a rewritten history that focuses on the sexism and racism of the man and the country he built. In his new book, Sir John A. Macdonald and the Apocalyptic Year, 1885, author and academic Patrice Dutil writes a book that looks at Macdonald in one of his most tumultuous years. He paints a different picture, though. He describes a man who, for all his sins, was the most enlightened and constructive public figure of early Canadian history. Patrice Dutil is a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at Toronto Metropolitan University. Joins me now to talk about the book. Patrice, thanks for the time.
Thank you very much for having me on.
You've written many books, many papers about Canadian history, but specifically about Sir John A., and I get the feeling you're not done yet. So why so many books and papers on Macdonald? What drives the fascination?
Oh, thanks for that question. The man is endlessly fascinating. I've come to John A. very late in my academic career. I'm mostly an Edwardian. My area of predilection, my area of interest, is usually the years before the First World War, because they're utterly fascinating. But John A. Really came to my attention in a new way when Richard Gwynne published his 2-volume biography, almost 20 years ago now. And I thought there was something else here that needed to be told. And so I devoted a good portion of my research to Sir John A. Macdonald. I published a book, an edited book 10 years ago, on Sir John A. New ideas brought in, bringing in new scholars and new thinking. And then I plowed into another book on prime ministerial power, its origins, and again focused on Macdonald, but also on his most important successors, Wilfrid, Laurier, and Robert Borden. And yet, when I was doing that, 1885 kept coming back. 1885, of course, the Riel insurrection in the Northwest Territories. Well, what they was called then in the Northwest. Today we call it Saskatchewan. Mm-hmm. The issue around Chinese immigration, the issue around electoral reform, the issue around smallpox epidemic, all these issues, but they'd all been looked at individually, but never as a collective. And I thought, my goodness, what an incredible story 1885 is, when literally the pressures of history combine in the space of weeks. And what was the impact on Macdonald? What was going through his mind? And that's a topic that had never been looked at in particular. So 1885 is a wonderful, I think, microcosm of Canadian history in that first, the last 30 years of the 19th century, and it's a really interesting laboratory to look at how Macdonald worked policy. What were his politics? That kind of stuff.
He wasn't a new politician at this point. I mean, he was well established even before 1867, but he'd been in and out of the prime minister's office and had just had a successful re-election in 1882, and all of these things came together at once. That must have been an incredibly stressful year.
Yeah, he's not a young man. He's born in 1815, so he's celebrating his 70th birthday. And it actually begins. The book begins with him coming home, and he's coming home. I should say he's coming home from Britain. The book begins and ends in Britain. He's in Britain in the fall of 1884 because he needs to sell Canada. He needs to sell the idea that Canada is a place worth investing in. Does that sound familiar? All these things that I'm going to talk about, that we're going to talk about, about this book or anything else, they're all very contemporary. This is stuff that Trudeau is looking at today that John A. would have recognized. He's going to Britain and he comes back, and of course there's a big party for him in Toronto, and there's an even bigger party for him in Montreal in early January of 1885. So that's how it begins. And he talks about his career. And the fact is that he's been in politics since the 1840s. So, I mean, it's a long career, and it's a lot of words, and it's a lot of policy. And when we're looking at his career, we can't forget that he may have made mistakes, yes, but he also accomplished a great deal.
For any politician in any given year, having just covered a lot of them going through the pandemic of the COVID pandemic, smallpox was deadly at the time. We don't think about it now. It was deadly. Dealing with just that in a year would be a lot. Dealing with a rebellion in the territories would have been a lot. He had all of that at once. So tell us about the smallpox outbreak and give us the backstory on that, and then how we reacted and how it affected him.
Well, here we get into issues of federalism. So in those days, issues around public health were mostly the jurisdiction of the provincial government. And what happened in 1885 is that the virus, the bacterium, worked its way through the train lines, and it came from the U.S. and landed in Montreal. And in Montreal, the French population, the Quebecois, were not inoculated. Some of them were. Most of them probably were. But a substantial portion of the Montrealers, the French Montrealers, were not inoculated against smallpox. And so it begins in the spring of 1885, and by September it is rampant. By the end of the year, by the end of 1885, 6,000 people are dead in Montreal and Quebec. It's an enormous amount of people. Far more than the 100 who died in the Northwest insurrection. 6,000 people. Now, what did the federal government do about this? Not a whole lot, I have to say. The issue is really a city issue, a Montreal issue, but it didn't spread. And the story is important here because what was Macdonald's responsibility, of course, was looking after the Indigenous people. And he made sure that the Indigenous people were inoculated. He had programs to inoculate the Indigenous people around Montreal in all the provinces. And so a remarkable story here of public health.
How can that be true? He was a racist who wanted to, just assimilate and take over. And
well, this is where I think that my book makes a contribution in demonstrating how, if you look at Macdonald's real policies, you may come to a very different conclusion. That there is a great deal of enlightenment in the approach John A. Macdonald had to governance, and this is a demonstration of it. People suffered. I mean, again, 6,000 people dying suddenly in 3 months largely because they were negligent, and the city of Montreal was negligent. It took a while to fix it, but in terms of the Indigenous population, it was preserved. Because
so he was inoculating whether it's a reserve like Kanesatake
Yes.
outside of Montreal or all the way out to the Northwest Territories.
Yeah. Again, it wasn't imposed on anybody, but if the Indigenous population wanted, and you have to remember, the Indigenous population had been devastated by diseases like smallpox in the past. The leading Indigenous leaders in the Northwest were scarred with previous bouts with smallpox. This is a serious disease, and the Indigenous people, unfortunately, knew it very well because it had ravaged their ranks.
So let's stick with his policies on Indigenous issues.
Yes.
Because that is why he is on the cancel list right now, primarily over residential schools.
Yes.
And I have to ask you, is it a fair assessment? The popular narrative that is out there would be that he was part of a genocide and this was a plan.
No, I reject that completely. That was not the intention of Sir John A. Macdonald. It all really, the idea of residential schools, first of all, is not his idea. And, if you want evidence of that, look at the report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. It talks endlessly about the experience of creating residential schools that practically goes to the beginning of New France. This was part of the European idea of Christianizing Indigenous people. That was their idea. And, again, this is typical of Europeans. Whether it was in Labrador or at the very tip of Argentina, that was the approach, or even in Asia. When Europeans come in, they want to Christianize. It's part of their mentality. It's part of their mission. It's their mission. So we had the same thing in Canada. John A. Macdonald picks up on that. In the 1880s, he's got a particular problem. And it really comes down. It really comes down to the buffalo. I don't want to be reductionist here, but the whole crisis in the West really comes out of this natural catastrophe, which is the disappearance of the buffalo. I say natural. Most of the buffalo were eradicated by the Americans as they traveled through the frontier and made their way into the American states. They were slaughtered for their meat, for their hides, and for sport, merely for sport. They were diseased also. The end result is a complete devastation of the stock, and the Indigenous people who made their living, who literally hunted for their survival, were stuck. They couldn't continue to pursue the buffalo. There's no buffalo left, and the Americans are really blocking them at the border. So that's a real problem. That means that
the buffalo herds they didn't know borders.
No, they're moving back and forth.
Yeah,
they're moving back. Well, what's left of them is moving back and forth. So there's a crisis here of historic proportions. How could you? It's impossible to exaggerate. Here you have peoples who had migrated, from the Hudson's Bay area, had followed the tracks of the Hudson's Bay Company to hunt for beaver furs, literally stuck now in the prairies, roaming around, looking for buffalo, and needing to survive. So, of course, the government of Canada signs various treaties to help the Indigenous people settle. That is done through the 1970s. It's actually started by John A. in the late 1869, but in 1870s it's actually continued by the Mackenzie government. Macdonald comes into power in 1878, returns to power in 1878, and he sees that the crisis, the hunger crisis, has not been looked after by the Liberals. What does he do? Well, my book documents the amount of expenditures, the amount of money John A. Macdonald and his government dedicated to helping the Indigenous people survive. Part of that is food. Part of that is helping them settle. Part of that is helping them get an education. And that was the whole notion behind residential schools. Keep in mind that in signing those treaties, the Indigenous people demanded two things in particular. protection on one thing, but they also wanted education and they also wanted medicines, in case there's trouble. A lot of people argue that the government of Canada didn't do enough for medicines. A lot of people will argue that the government of Canada didn't do enough for education. But I find that difficult to reconcile. I think Macdonald did a lot.
You point out using politicians in their own words, and I should say, one of the interesting things about your book is you don't edit their words. You put them in and you say right at the beginning, look, some of the language in this book is going to be offensive to modern ears. If Macdonald refers to someone as a half-breed, which is what they called Métis at the time, you just leave that in because that's how he spoke, but so did everyone else. When he refers to people as Indians instead of Indigenous, you leave that in. But you quote people extensively, and as much as people will look back now with revisionist viewpoints on the residential schools, it's well documented that the opposition Liberals complained loudly that you're spending too much on the Indians. Stop spending so much money on those Indians.
Yeah, and it's actually in that context that Macdonald, retorts, and it's always quoted back to him, but it's quoted in the wrong context. We're keeping them half starved. He's in the House and he's saying to the Liberals, look, we're doing our best. We're not going to let them die, but we are keeping them half starved. At least they can survive. The idea that at least they can survive and live another day. They're not going to be, they're not going to have full bellies, but at least they'll survive. And again, it's important to remember the context here. We're not delivering food, by FedEx in refrigerated trucks. There is no railway. There is no railway. There is no way of transportation for the foodstuffs going out in the Northwest. It is literally
because the railway wasn't completed.
It's not completed until 1885. But it's remarkable that we're expecting the government of Canada in the 1880s to deliver rations to people in the Northwest. Now, again, the government does succeed to some degree, and that's what's remarkable. They do find cattle. They do find ways to provide rations. And they're providing rations, by the way, to Indigenous people who are refugees from the United States. Because they're coming to Canada because there's food in Canada. There's no food in the United States, but there's food in Canada. And who's providing that food? It's Sir John A. Macdonald and his Conservative government in the 1880s.
So I wanted to ask you about that, that it should be widely known, but it's not talked about now in the current narrative, that Canada, under Sir John A. Macdonald, was seen as a refuge for many Indigenous peoples coming up from the U.S.
It was known. We've forgotten. And in today's climate, when the accusations are hurled at Macdonald, there are very few voices to respond. This is a knowledge that's been forgotten or neglected, and it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate, and yet, as I've written elsewhere, it's utterly understandable because we've now had two generations, including most of the politicians who are working today, two generations who've never heard of Sir John A. Macdonald because we don't cover it in school. You have to be of a certain age to remember the days when Pierre Burton had a fabulous series on the CBC in the mid-1970s. So you have to be at least 64, 65 years old to remember seeing that series on the CBC. After that, there's nothing. John A. Macdonald is not part of the popular culture, and he's been erased from the curriculum. And as I say, he's been erased from the curriculum for over 40 years. How do you expect anybody to have an answer when the last time you touched Sir John A. Macdonald was when you were 11 years old or 12 years old in grade 7, and that was only for a few minutes. Otherwise, we do not cover Sir John A. Macdonald in high school. And as I've pointed out many times before, and I'll say it again ad nauseum, there are only 3 provinces in this country where a credit in Canadian history is required to graduate high school. In most of Canada, you do not need a Canadian history credit. You do not need to know Canadian history in order to get high school. Find me another country that is so ridiculous. But anyway, I am digressing.
Tell me which provinces, because
3 provinces that require a credit in Canadian history are Ontario, Manitoba, and Quebec.
Okay, if you're
a francophone, by the way, in Nova Scotia and PEI, you do need one. But if you're an anglophone, you don't need one. Because an Anglophone doesn't really need to know Canadian history. It's utterly, I'm not saying that kids are not graduating with high school history. I'm just saying, they're just not required to do it. And so if you're not inclined, why would you do it? It should be a requirement of our citizenship that you will know our history. And again, in high school, we start with the First World War. That's a wonderful thing. The First World War was an extremely painful experience for our country, for our forefathers. But I think that to get Sir John A. Macdonald exposed to an adolescent mind, at least an adolescent mind, not a child of 11 or 12, might raise awareness, which would create a robustness that could resist the sloppy thinking that is now part of the narrative around Sir John A. Macdonald.
Well, before we leave his Indigenous policies, this might explain what you've just said about it not being taught in schools, might explain why every time I raise the fact that Sir John A. extended the vote, extended the franchise, not only to women, but to Indigenous, not everyone, but not everyone got the vote back then. He extended it to the Indigenous population to a degree. They looked at me stunned. And no, that couldn't possibly be. So who exactly got the vote when he did extend it? And how long did that last?
It happened in 1885, of course. Like everything else, it happened in 1885, which is remarkable. Here John A. is fighting off the Brits because the Brits want him to fight in Sudan. He's saying, no, we're not going to Sudan. He's fighting off the Americans because the Americans want to fish even more in coastal waters. And he says, okay, this is the time to reintroduce my bill on and expanding the franchise, expanding the right to vote for Canadians. This is really quite something.
Because at that point you had to be male and a landowner, right? You
had to have $150 worth of stuff, and it could be a house, it could be tools. If you're a workman, a laborer, it wasn't onerous, and there were variations, and every province had its variation. And this is something that Macdonald had wanted to do forever. He wanted the federal government to have control on the federal franchise. At that point, it was the provinces, and he suspected that things were, if you have an enemy party in government in New Brunswick or Nova Scotia, they're going to tinker with things and make sure that the Conservatives don't vote or do whatever. He was just very suspicious, and he thought it was just a matter of just common sense, and the Constitution provided for it, that the federal government would look after the federal franchise. So in 1885, he proposes that women be given the right to vote as long as they have the same material qualifications as a male. That idea is shot down. It's shot down by the Conservatives, and it's shot down by the Liberals. He also proposes that Indigenous men who meet the qualifications also be given the right to vote. This is at the time when Frog Lake is taking place. The Frog Lake Massacre is taking place in the Northwest, where basically a number of Indigenous warriors killed 10 people, 10 settlers in Saskatchewan. People will say, "Are you serious? You're going to give the vote to those people?" And he says, "Yes, I'm going to give the vote to those people because they are citizens of this country." This is John A. Macdonald at the height of the insurrection making this demand. The end result will be that Indigenous men will get the right to vote, except in Saskatchewan, in the Northwest Territories. But everywhere else, they will get the right to vote. And there's a study, not mine, there's a study out there that demonstrated that they did vote. And in Ontario, in particular, in a number of ridings in Ontario, where in fact they held arguably a balance of power. And most of the time, those Indigenous people voted Conservative. Sometimes they voted Liberal, but most of the time they voted Conservative. That's not my study, it's another colleague. And so it demonstrated that the Indigenous men who had the property qualifications did vote. That Macdonald was right. These people understand freedom. They understand what this country is about, and he was fully confident that they could exercise their vote. Maybe he was being bullish, maybe he thought they'd all be good Tories, but who knows? He was willing to take the chance, is my point. He was willing to take the chance.
We've got to take a quick break, but when we come back, I want to ask you about the 1885 rebellion, about its impact on Macdonald's, tumultuous year, but also how do we turn it around in terms of putting things forward? Bellevue House, we'll talk about that as well when we come back.
This episode is brought to you by Etsy.
Oh.
Hear that?
Okay. Thank you.
Etsy knows these aren't the sounds of holiday gifting. Well, not the ones you're hoping for. You want squeals of delight. Happy tears.
How did you?
And spontaneously written songs of joy.
I am so happy. Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah.
Okay, the song needs a bit of work, but anyway, to get those reactions, make sure everyone on your list feels heard with handmade, handpicked, and designed gifts from small shops on Etsy. Gifts like personalized jewelry, custom artwork, cozy style items, vintage pieces, and home decor to celebrate all of your favorite people and their specific kind of special. For original gifts that say, I get you, Etsy has it.
I'm James McComb, reporting live from home in my bathrobe and slippers. Tonight, we're talking Dunkin' Polar Peppermint Coffee. Gene's here with the latest. Gene, do you copy?
The home with Dunkin' is where you want to be.
Patrice, I mentioned off the top that, all the statues taken down, and here at Queen's Park, it's boarded up and who knows what will happen. What's remarkable to me is that nobody has noticed the statue to the men who went and fought. It's on the grounds of the legislature, of the men who went and fought in the 1885 rebellion for the government, recognizes battles like Cut Knife Hill and things like that. Once upon a time, putting down the rebellion was taught a certain way in English schools. I know how I was taught, but apparently if you were in Manitoba or Saskatchewan, especially in a French school, you were given a very different view of that history. How should we view it from your perspective as you look at the impact of the Second Rebellion in 1885 in Macdonald's tumultuous year?
How should we see it? Well, I would say that you have to see it the way contemporaries had to see it. What happened here is that Louis Riel declares the area on the North Saskatchewan River to be an area separate from the rest of Canada. He creates a provisional government. He says that in this jurisdiction, the government of Canada has no authority. Now, I don't think it takes too much imagination, even today, to think that if somebody said, I am not recognizing Canada, I am seizing this territory, and then I'm going to kill policemen. I think that even today, the reaction would be very similar to what happened in 1885, namely that we will not put up with this kind of thing. The state, the authority of the state is being challenged directly, and the state has the obligation to defend its integrity. I don't think today would be different. But this is what happened in Saskatchewan in 1885. The RCMP was attacked. 8 men died at Duck Lake. Is it surprising that the Macdonald government, it would have been any government, would have done the same? The Liberals would have done the same. I'm absolutely sure of it.
And yet today, it was just a couple of weeks ago, we had Louis Riel Day. And I had statements from all kinds of politicians. You don't get that on Sir John A.'s birthday. Sir John A. is, as we said, on the cancel list. And Riel, who was not a hero in the education I was given many, many years ago, is now a hero. In Saskatchewan, they've got the highway named for him, Highway 11.
Yes, absolutely. There's been a radical transformation, and this has been the product of 50 years of work by the Métis community to have Louis Riel recognized as a national hero. To a degree, I'm sympathetic. I am a francophone, and there is a romantic aura around Louis Riel that he was defending the French language, and for that, and defending the Métis. By the way, the Métis community is 2 communities. You have to remember that. They were called Métis if they were francophone. They were called half-breeds if they were anglophone. Because don't forget, there is a big Scottish presence in the Northwest Territory where a lot of these guys married Indigenous women or united with Indigenous women and created a half-breed community. They had a lot of associations with the Métis people. So they were 2 communities inside that agglomeration of people that that had both heritages, both had inherited from both the English and the French. My point is that romantic aura has developed. I cite Pierre Trudeau in 1968, even as late as 1968, saying, "Wait a minute, the guy raised arms against the Canadian government. There's got to be something wrong here." But yeah, where the politicians have bent over backwards to hail Louis Riel, who arguably put 100 people to death as a result of his ridiculous campaign in 1885. The government of Canada was doing nothing to the Métis people. It's not like it was pursuing them. They were surveying lands. They were leaving the people alone. What was the reasoning to raise a military campaign against the government of Canada? There was no reason, except perhaps paranoia or fear, and Louis Riel was a paranoid. Regardless, I think that Riel did a terrible thing in 1885, and the government reacted as you would expect them to react. So Louis Riel as a figure, as I said, has become romanticized, immensely romanticized, and unfairly romanticized. There is opposition. I mean, there are some scholars who've written a different account, but right now, Louis Riel is living his golden years in terms of being remembered.
I can understand the desire of some people to say, okay, well, look at the good he did, or look, he's a hero to this community. And I understand that. And I would just say what I say about people who want to criticize or tear down Macdonald. Let's look at them in the full story. Don't just put them off to one side and pigeonhole them. What was the full story? What was their full record? And Macdonald is someone who, his full people will just dismiss him. I'm a history geek, and when I was up in Ottawa and working in Center Block, people would just be dismissive. Oh, you showed up drunk all the time to Parliament.
That's silly. That's just silly. That's just silly. I can't stand that. I mean, Johnny Macdonald,
did he have a drinking problem at one point?
He had a drinking problem at one point. You put yourself in his shoes, you'll have the same thing. He was suffering terrible gallstones. He was under enormous pressure to set up the government of Canada in the late 1860s. The fact is, he dried up. He dried up 7-8 years later. He came to Toronto. And what do you do when you come to Toronto? Well, you stop drinking, okay? Because it's Toronto the good. And Macdonald moved to Toronto for a couple of years. And he dried up. I mean, if you look at the accounts, there is no account of him being, a drunk, out of his mind drunk after the mid 1870s. So yeah, he had a bad period. Everybody drank in those days. There's a temperance movement launched because the problem of drinking is so bad. But I think that the real story around Macdonald is that he moderates. He actually trains those demons, and he's no longer a habitual drinker from the 1870s onward. So that's not an excuse. And I come back to what you said about Louis Riel. I actually would challenge that. What did Louis Riel actually do except contribute a memory? He actually did nothing for the Métis people. He did nothing. I mean, I'm sure I'll be.
You'll be on the cancel
harshly.
list.
Oh, I'm already on the cancel list. I mean, but I would challenge anybody to tell me what Louis Riel actually contributed, except for a memory. Otherwise, I don't see what he's done. Compare that to what Sir John A. Macdonald accomplished. In 1 month. In 1 month, given any month, there's no comparison. And yet, as you say, 9 of the 11 statues in Canada dedicated to Sir John A. Macdonald from 1895 onwards are now destroyed or in storage. There's only 2 left, and they're under police guard.
The one that actually breaks my heart, other than the one at Queen's Park, was Picton. They had a fun statue of Sir John A. Macdonald standing next to the witness box, and it was in the area where he had practiced law, and the statue was of him at that age. And you could, stand in the witness box and get your photo taken with him, which, of course, I did. But now it's gone. I want to talk about the railroad and a couple of other things, but you've mentioned that a lot of Indigenous voters, when they got the vote, voted for him. Today, when we look at Quebec, people say, conservatives will never do well in Quebec except around Quebec City. But you've got a chart on your website that shows that he was up and down in Quebec, but at times, including 1882, the election that had him in power in this time period, in this tumultuous year, he won the majority of seats in that province.
Well, what's remarkable is that, and I developed that whole notion in my book. The reality is that in the election following the terrible year of 1885, Sir Johnny Macdonald is handily reelected and increases his vote in Quebec. So Quebec, which apparently was absolutely distraught by the death of Louis Riel, still supports Sir John A. And then in the last election in 1891, he and his coalition will actually earn more than 50% of the vote. And that's against a francophone Quebecer, Wilfrid Laurier. So tell me that Sir John A. Macdonald was unpopular, and this came out of the report of the city of Montreal when they justified the tearing down of the statue in Canada Square, that Macdonald was never popular in Quebec. Well, I'm sorry, look at the facts. All I'm doing here is pointing to the facts. Macdonald was highly popular in Quebec. And there are a lot of reasons why you would not want to be popular in Quebec if you're the prime minister at that time, namely that the economy is going so badly in Quebec that people are leaving. There are more Dutils, my family name. There are more Dutils today in Maine than there are in Montreal, in Quebec.
They went down for the
factory jobs.
Yeah.
There were jobs. People were leaving. They knew that the government was not was not helping to protect their jobs. But in the 19th century, you would never expect the government of Canada to protect your job. Those people who remained clearly thought that Sir John A. Macdonald was still worth a vote after 20 years in power, with all the terrible things that happened in 1885, with the pandemic, with the death of Louis Riel. They still think Sir John A. is worth another vote. Now, again, square that with the way he's being criticized today. I think that we're in a mode of thinking here that's ahistorical, where people who have the microphone are who are in government are not doing the job of rectifying the record, and maybe I'm expecting too much of our elected politicians.
I think people simply do not know the history, which is why I'd encourage people to read your book. The airport in Ottawa is called Macdonald-Cartier Airport. The 401 is actually the Macdonald-Cartier Highway, because he had a powerful coalition in Quebec and a powerful partner in Georges-Etienne Cartier. I used to love when my office was in Old Montreal in Saint-Jacques, walking by the plaque up for the office that Cartier had down there.
In 1885, in fact, because everything happens in 1885, he unveils the statue to his old friend who died, almost 15 years before. And he remembers him fondly. This was the man who paved the way for Sir John A. Macdonald, an eloquent man who sold the Québécois, the French Canadians, on the idea that Canada was worth, as René Lévesque said later on, a beau risque, that there were going to be problems in associating yourself with an English majority, but it might still be worth it, because there might still be some new ideas of nationality that could emerge from this, that could elevate the human existence in the Canadian country, in the Canadian countryside. Noble ideas that anybody today would stand by, anybody who's right thinking would stand by, that inspired a generation. Georges-Etienne Cartier was that kind of man, and John A. Macdonald had the wisdom to recognize that. He was a great political ally.
Now, after, not related to 1885, so allow me to go past that, but after Laurier does finally win in 1896, first Francophone prime minister, he's liberal. Quebec does become a liberal stronghold, and has been for most of its time since then. Was there a mythology built up around Laurier? I mean, you've studied this great prime minister as well. How did he make that turn for the province that's been at the center of so many of our debates and challenges over the years?
Well, no, Sir Wilfrid comes in 1896. Of course, the Conservatives are completely exhausted. And they wind up with old Sir Charles Tupper as leader, and Laurier, who's been in office, I mean, has been in Parliament for 20 years at that point, is an experienced man. He's an experienced debater. He's an experienced politician. He knows everybody in Quebec. He's brought people around him who are fantastic organizers. People like Israel Tarte and Raoul d'Endurant. These are names that, of course, are very close to my heart, but they're completely unknown today. What I'm saying is that Laurier came into power because he forged a phenomenal coalition in Quebec and also in English Canada. And then he had the great luck of being prime minister at a moment when Canada just explodes in terms of wealth, in terms of prosperity. We have wheat growing in the West. We have a critical mass of farmers in the West who are growing the country, who are growing the economy. Things are doing well in Eastern Canada, and Laurier rides the coattails. He's also a great prime minister. He's a great manager, and he's got ideas. To the last days of his government, he has ideas. Of course, French Canada loved this man. He was eloquent. He was eloquent. He made them proud. Laurier made the French Canadians across Canada very proud. And then, of course, the Conservatives shoot themselves in the foot, quite literally. And I wrote a book about that. 2 books, actually, with my colleague David Mackenzie, on the 1911 election and the 1917 election. The Conservatives literally blow it. And this experience will hurt them right through the generations. It goes up through, there are ups and downs. There's Diefenbaker, who convinces Quebec in 1958, with the help of Maurice Duplessis, the Quebec premier. But, as once people realize this guy Diefenbaker, he really doesn't understand Canada, they actually vote against him, and they'll give the Liberals and Pearson their support in 62, 63. But yeah, it's a long story. Had the magic of Macdonald been preserved, had it been bottled and passed on to the next generation, surely the Conservatives would have done better. There are signs of revival. Maine in 1925 did a remarkable job. Again, this is Arthur Meehan, one of the worst politicians that ever walked the land. One of the worst politicians. But he got some support in Quebec because Mackenzie King, and by the way, I've got a book on Mackenzie King coming out next year, because Mackenzie King was such a nondescript prime minister in the first years of the 1920s. But they have to recapture that Macdonald magic, and it's not easy.
Let's go back to 1885 to round out the chat, and the railroad. I mean, that's one that people still know at least a little bit about. They've seen. There's a photo somewhere of a guy with a hammer and a top hat. But, I didn't realize all the things that happened in 1885 until your book. This was the original promise of Macdonald in uniting the country, was, especially when they brought in British Columbia, we'll bring a railroad. It took a while, maybe not as long as our Eglinton Crosstown here in Toronto.
Doesn't that put things in perspective? Look, I mean, you've been to the Rockies, whether you've been in a plane or whether you've been on the highway, you realize how difficult it is to cut through that land, to create a grade for a train, an 1880s train to travel. The engineering marvel that we have in a CPR is extraordinary, but it took time. Yeah. Macdonald built that railroad. And I talk about it in the book. I mean, he had tremendous trouble in convincing even members of his own cabinet that the CPR was worth it. I mean, it's a lot of money. And, the government is always guaranteeing loans because in those days, you didn't pay for it. The government had no money to pay for things. You had to get the private sector to provide financing. But what the government could do was provide guarantees, raise bonds to help pay for things. It comes through in 1885, and when the Riel attacks the Canadian government, the railroad is nearly done, not completely done, but nearly done, so that you can actually move troops from Montreal. And there are French contingents, French regiments in Montreal that are going to take the train to go to the west. It's just as popular in Montreal as it is in Toronto. And they will take their trains to go fight Riel. And they're there within 3 weeks. So it's phenomenal. Compared to the first rebellion of Louis Riel in 1870, it took 3 months to move the troops to Winnipeg. Here you had to go further, and you did it in 3 weeks. So yeah, the CPR, that really saved Macdonald's bacon. But again, he had the foresight to stick with it. It was, as you say, the original promise. This was the promise of Canada articulated in the 1860s, before Confederation. In the 1860s, people like Georges-Étienne Cartier, people like Samuel Tilley in New Brunswick, Charles Tupper in Nova Scotia, George Brown in Ontario. What are they thinking about? They're thinking about the West. Yeah, they're thinking about their little provinces, but they know that the West is where it is, and they know that the West is where the Americans will challenge Canada's sovereignty. That, right, this is something that we forget. Canada had to assert sovereignty in a land that was sparsely populated. There are, at best, 20,000 Indigenous people roaming the land in Western Canada at that period. That's not enough for the American army. And it is a blessing, because I can't explain it otherwise, why the Americans resisted invading Canada when it had the largest standing army in the world and could have walked into the territory, could have walked into Manitoba, what we know as Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta, and even British Columbia. After the Civil War, they could have walked in and taken it. They had Alaska, right? Mm-hmm. Alaska. The deal was signed in Alaska in 1867, a few months before Confederation. But it had been in the works forever, and the Canadians knew this. It had been in the works forever. How the Americans didn't seize that opportunity is amazing to me, amazing to anybody who looks at the record. And thank goodness that they didn't. Well, yeah, thank goodness they didn't. It became a land for Canadians and for our philosophy of government and for our philosophy of life, flawed as it may be.
The railway that opened in 1885, we're still using it today.
Yes.
And
it's been repaired.
Yeah, a few times, yeah. Tracks have been replaced.
Yes.
But anyone that thinks that, well, we don't really use rail anymore, it's not a big thing. Just think about the double rail strikes and the impact that was going to have on the economy. Unless you're urbanites like you and I, a lot of people will not travel by rail all that often anymore. But the goods and services, this is still to this day a fundamental linchpin of Canada's economy.
Absolutely. And if you'll allow me, Brian, I mean, that picture, that iconic picture you mentioned, about the last spike. It is a beautiful picture, but it did leave out the Chinese workers. And I think that it's important for us, again, in remembering that period, it's important for us to recognize that 600 of those guys died in building the railway from 1881 to 1885, 1886. 600. That's a lot of people. And a lot of people think that John A. Macdonald was a racist in terms of the Chinese because, he did, and again, you got to say this, he did refuse the right to vote to the Chinese. He's willing to give it to the Indigenous, but he's not willing to give it to the Chinese. And he has two reasons for that. Number one, because the people from British Columbia, the politicians from British Columbia, are exerting enormous pressures on him to make sure that the Chinese do not vote. Why? Because they potentially hold the balance of power in British Columbia. Almost 10% of the men in British Columbia at that time were Chinese. And there's a lot of fear that, between the Liberals and the Conservatives, it'll be the Chinese bloc that will determine the win. And that can't be very democratic. And Macdonald is forced to make that. He does it as an amendment at the very last minute. He's not a racist. He doesn't want to do this. He's even created a royal commission that concluded that the Chinese people, they're all men. The Chinese men are actually honorable people. They're honorable people who are making a contribution to this country. This is the product of Sir John A. Macdonald, his doing, a royal commission that says that the Chinese are not a threat to this country. I talk about that in the book. But let's remember the 600 Chinese men, over 600, who died for this. And it's an important part of the story of 1885, I think.
Patrice, I could keep asking you question after question and talk about history all day, but We both do have to get on to the day job. So thank you so much for your time. I encourage everyone to check out the new book on 1885. Truly fantastic. Thanks so much for the time.
Thank you very much for your time.
Full Comment is a post-media podcast. My name's Brian Lilly, your host. This episode was produced by Andre Prue. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Kevin Libin is the executive producer. Again, please subscribe to Full Comment on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Amazon, wherever you listen, and help us out by giving us a rating, leaving a review, and telling your friends about us. Thanks for listening. Until next time, I'm Brian Lilly.